I first wanted to start out, Dorothy reminds me in her presentation that we can't take things for granted. And of course, I was going to start my talk right into the journey that Man Ray took us on or takes us on in the journey from mathematics to Shakespeare. That, of course, assumes that everybody knows who Man Ray was. So very briefly, if you go to the exhibition and go to the prologue, since the exhibition and the catalog are organized in a series of acts and scenes, you'll learn something about this tremendously prolific artist, an American artist who was born Emanuel Rudnitsky in 1890 of a Jewish Russian immigrant family whose name was then shortened to Man Ray, who was instrumental in the early 20th century, first in the Dada movements, both in New York and then Paris, and then subsequently in Hollywood and later back to Paris. So the journey that is currently illustrated on display at the Phillips Collection is one that took Man Ray, the artist, across 2 continents, 2 decades, and multiple disciplines. The artist began his career in New York and in 1920 moved to Paris to follow the Surrealist and Dada avant-garde at the time. Now the journey, as everybody who has been introduced to the exhibition, and you get these really interesting expressions on people's faces when you say, Man Ray, Human Equations, a journey from mathematics to Shakespeare. I'm going to take you along with Man Ray on a very truncated Cliff Notes version of this journey, which indeed, for those of us putting it together, was one which took us approximately 5 years. So Man Ray, when he was working in Paris, along with many members of the Surrealist movement, was invited by his friend, the Surrealist artist Max Ernst, to visit the Institut Henri Poincaré, a math institute founded in 1928 in Paris by the esteemed mathematician, something that Florence is going to tell us a little bit more about. Now, when he came into this institute, one of the things that he said was, he subsequently said, I discovered some objects in Paris. They are called solid geometry. They're man-made objects to illustrate geometrical algebraic equations. I was fascinated by their shapes. I was also fascinated by their captions, which to me were Greek. One was called 16 Points of Kummer, 8 of which are false. So for Man Ray, he was fascinated, acknowledgedly, by the forms. They were intriguing forms which for him followed along with his interest in transforming 3-dimensional objects into 2-dimensional images. So in the course of a 2-year period, 1933 and 1934, Man Ray photographed these objects, and he did what Man Ray was well known for doing, which was using light, camera angle, dramatic perspective, and cropping to create these mysterious, enigmatic images that take the objects out of context and begin to incorporate certain kinds of personifications or animations of the objects that he will subsequently take further when he gets to Hollywood a decade later. So after seeing these models, which I'm showing you here, this is a little temptation, a little seduction into the exhibition itself. This is an installation view where you can see on the wall behind you the type of environment in which these dusty models would have been seen. You see Man Ray's photographs, and in the upper left-hand corner, you see the hexacosacoron, the triangular form, again, which Florence is going to talk a little bit about, and the dramatic way in which he transforms these models into animated forms. Now, in the context of the Surrealist movement in Paris at the time, these objects became a point of great interest. Man Ray's photographs played an instrumental role in that process. As you can see here, there was a whole issue of the very famous journal, the Cahiers d'Art, that was dedicated in 1936 to mathematics and abstract art. In an issue in an article that was written by the journal's editor, Christian Servos, and another essay in there by the Surrealist leader, André Breton, in which Man Ray's photographs played a critical role in illustrating these concepts of the models. At the same time, in 1936, at the Gallery Charles Retton, the exhibition, the Surrealist Exhibition of Objects, a seminal exhibition at the time, was actually in which you could see combinations of Salvador Dali's work, Man Ray's work, other of the surrealist artists juxtaposed against non-Western objects, African objects, oceanic masks, and some of the mathematical models, all of which were incorporated into the notion of the surrealist object. So for Man Ray, he took these objects and took them and turned them into forms, into the two-dimensional photographic forms that became an embraced part of the modernist discourse at the time. They were featured, in fact, in the Dada Surrealism Fantastic Art exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1936. So where do we go from this journey where we started with the mathematical models, and how do we get to Shakespearean equations? Well, Man Ray in 1940 was forced to leave Paris at the time in which the German troops arrived, and he moved to the United States. And he came back to New York where his family was and quickly decided that he was going to go someplace else and got in a car across country with a tie salesman and landed in Hollywood, where he said there was more surrealism rampant than there was anyplace else in the entire world. So he, of course, felt right at home. What he proceeded to do was to start to incorporate, to think about some of the things that he left behind. He had no idea what was going to still survive from what he had to leave behind, but he also subsequently then started to look at things that he had brought back with him, ideas that constantly circulated in his mind. And I like to call Man Ray the original quintessential recycler, because for Man Ray, there was no distinction between an original, this notion of the model or the two-dimensional representation, the painting, the photograph, or in film. So he worked across these disciplines, but when he got to Hollywood, he actually returned to his first love, which was painting. And he decided that he would return and spend his time and his energy on painting. And in 1947, he started working on a series of paintings based on the mathematical model photographs that came back with him, that he brought back with him from Paris. And in these works, his wife, Juliet Man Ray, wrote to his niece and said, Man is working on this really interesting series of paintings based on the mathematical models. He calls them human equations. So we see automatically this time that Man Ray's turning through his mind, how do I take these mathematical models and turn them into some personification, animated form? And as you can see here, these are also installation views from the exhibition at the Phillips. And what he's done is taken these and done what he sees mask forms in the mathematical models and translates them into Othello. Why Shakespeare? Well, for Man Ray, the Shakespeare came later. Shakespeare was very important at this time in Hollywood, as you can imagine. The first film, Hamlet, Laurence Olivier, had just hit the screens. Walter Arensberg, a major collector and friend of Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp, was a scholar of Shakespeare. So there's much speculation. But for Man Ray, he said, no, I don't want to put surrealist titles. These paintings, for me, each manifest a personification of a different Shakespeare play. So he gave each one the name of a different Shakespearean play. So what I'm showing you here, Othello in front. We see the Merchant of Venice in the back. And we see how Man Ray integrates, even in the objects, in the paintings there, he has his own objects that he created, which is here called Permanent Traction, a chess piece that appears even in his Shakespearean models. And the chess form that became a very important part of his artistic career from 1916, when Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray played chess together, this constant theme appears throughout his interest in both the Shakespearean equations and the mathematical models. So I'm showing you here a couple of really intriguing views in which you can actually go and play the game. You can play a game that Man Ray played with anybody during a talk or when he would visit his studio. He'd say, "What do you think this one is?" And he said, sometimes they would get it, sometimes they wouldn't. It was just as well. So as we see in here, the first time ever that the mathematical models, Man Ray's photographs, and the paintings have been brought together. And this is the first time that this has ever taken place. And we've done this as a way to offer our visitors the amazing experience of looking at three-dimensional objects and seeing how Man Ray translated them into two-dimensional forms, both in his photographs and then his subsequent interpretation in the paintings. We have here an example of a Meissner surface, one of the mathematical models from the Institut Poincaré. All of these models were actually lent, the very models that Man Ray photographed. And he looked at it and he said, "This model reminds me of a skull." So immediately he interpreted it in his painting and called it Hamlet. So, of course, alas, poor York, I knew him well. And so making that kind of association, he translated it into the painting. But then Man Ray, being Man Ray, he decided to do something else. He added a little colored point in the corner, and in his words, added a little erotical element, if you will. So this breast becomes Ophelia, as Man Ray himself would come to say. So the playfulness, the wittiness in which Man Ray approached all of his work clearly comes to bear in the mathematical models and the Shakespearean equations. Now I'm going to play the game with you that Man Ray liked to play with people. What Shakespearean equation might this be? Which Shakespearean play? Well, if we look at the mathematical model in the front, and it's been transformed through the light and the shadow that he saw in the photograph. And to me, it appears as some sort of a regal form on a throne. And Man Ray throws in the back, just for extra measure. This is one of a found objects, a leg of a table that he himself had used as a found object in his own artwork. So we have someone sitting on a throne, perhaps in a military kind of weaponry, protective garb, and a scepter in the background. Anybody want to venture a guess at who this might be? Did I hear a Julius Caesar? It is Julius Caesar. It's Julius Caesar. So for Man Ray, again, it looks like a decapitated torso. He animates the objects. He creates something completely different from the form that you see on there. But a cue or an interesting facet into looking at Man Ray's work in this series is look in the detail, in the objects, in the numbers and equations that are on the blackboard behind him. So as I've written in the catalog, devices such as inversion, negation, doubling, disjunction, and symbolic form common to mathematics are technically employed by surrealists in order to achieve the movement's professed goal of going beyond the real. The prevalence of such devices in the work of Man Ray and many surrealist artists begs the question, is this confluence merely coincidental, or do surrealism and modern mathematics share something of the same spirit? Or is there something surreal about mathematics that drew these artists to this realm? So as you can see in the work that's here, what Man Ray did was first began with what appears as fairly rational equations. We have a small a is to large A, as small b is to large b. Similarly, A is to B, as small a is to small b, as large A is to capital A, B. Now, these may at first appear as random or arcane scrawls, but actually, Man Ray's formulations are antiquated ways of expressing the law of proportions, a concept that Man Ray may well have recalled from his early training in draftsmanship, architectural studies, and engineering. So can it only be a coincidence that the, again, ostensibly nonsensical 2 plus 2 equals 22 also expresses a literal translation of the mathematical concept of concatenation, or the linking of things together in a chain. But ultimately, when we look at the final equation on here, Man Ray leaves us to solve the square root of Man Ray, the answer to which is left up for us to actually answer. And again, it's interesting to look at when you look at this thing that it's the answer to the square root of expressed would be a radical, and that the quintessentially radical artist encases him in this symbol. So Man Ray was actually engaged on a multiple level. People come and say, well, what did Man Ray know about the math? He himself acknowledged that the equations were completely Greek to him, but his understanding and interest in math was clearly reflected in his interest in these objects. Now, the symbolic portrait of Julius Caesar and the use of these kinds of equations, enigmatic equations, were not original into Man Ray's work. This is the artist Marius Desius, a fellow artist in the Stieglitz Circle in New York in the teens, who created these enigmatic character portraits, object portraits. The left of Agnes Meyer, one of the members of the Stieglitz Circle, on the right, actually a portrait of Alfred Stieglitz himself. It's hard to see in these, the equations, using these enigmatic equations as symbolic forms, as ways to get deeper into the object portrait, is something that Man Ray would have well been aware of, and in which we can see Julius Caesar as being an successor to that kind of style. Now, people ask, what did Man Ray know about math? Well, Man Ray was very interested. He was studied as a draftsman. Geometric forms were of great interest to him. These are just some of his early drawings, 1908, 1910, and a later drawing that he did with the spiral with his wife at the time, Adam Lacroix. So when we look to the mathematic inspiration for Man Ray, it is perhaps best expressed in this quintessential painting that he painted 2 years following his visit to the Institut Henri Poincaré, a painting called La Quadrature. This is one day I had a dream. I had discovered the solution of the squaring of the circle, how to transform a square into a circle. I made a circle from string, and then I pulled it with 4 fingers to make 4 corners, and it became a square. Mathematically, it's not possible, except I won't justify my dreams through logic. It must remain mysterious. So here we see Man Ray's engagement with mathematical objects and themes that were of interest to throughout the early 20th century avant-garde, and how he incorporated some of these forms into his own work in a really interesting way. I only yesterday, when I was going through the exhibition on a tour, discovered that indeed not only do we have here the different mathematical forms, squaring the circle and a circle in another form, but he's actually put this all within another circle. There's actually a larger circle that's encompassing the form, and then it's all squared by the frame itself. So there's multiple layers that Man Ray introduces to us as he takes us on this journey. In one of his most famous paintings, Le Beau Temps from 1939, you can see that his engagement with these mathematical models and mathematical forms and engagements of forms were always something that continued to repeat in his work. And finally, I wanted to bring you to All's Well That Ends Well. For Man Ray, this constant engagement with these models that followed him for 2 decades as he worked first in Hollywood and then went back to Paris to revisit these models, were something that he saw as a way to engage viewers in taking dreams or illogical equations or different ideas to a new level. So what he does here with the model, which you can actually see is this teeny little model that's up here, he removes its supports, he removes its braces, and he lifts it off the surface of the canvas by putting this cloth underneath it, and the objects begin to float off into space, and they become something like his rayographs, which Tristan Tzara, the Dadaist writer, called objects that dream in their sleep. So for Man Ray, the constant recircling of these ideas, the mathematical models were not something that were an aberration or something just unique to this time in his life. These were ideas that followed him throughout his career. I hope you all will come and join us at the Phillips Collection and take this very truncated journey that I've taken you on here and follow it in its fullest form. Thank you very much.